That brings us now to the field of descriptive linguistics. Descriptive linguistics applies a scientific perspective to the study of spoken language and involves several interrelated areas of analysis. Um, so we'll list each of these in turn and then talk about some of them at least in a bit more depth. The first is phonology. This is the study of speech sounds. So this will consider what sounds are present and significant in given languages. We'll talk about this on the very next slide. The second area is morphology. This studies the forms in which sounds combine to form morphemes or meaningful parts. So this includes words. It can also include parts of words. So we might look at prefixes and suffixes, for example, to see how that changes a word's meaning. The lexicon refers to the dictionary that contains all of the language's morphemes and their meanings. And so we'll talk about this with respect to something called a focal vocabulary. When we need more lexical contrasts, we create more distinctions. And then lastly, the fourth area of descriptive linguistics is syntax. This is how we arrange words in phrases and sentences. And so we'll talk about this with respect to Noam Chomsky with the idea of universal grammar, and then Sapir and Whorf with the idea of how language influences thought. And so with respect to phonology, we look at these speech sounds that are present in particular languages. This is defined as a phoneme. A phoneme is a sound contrast that makes a difference and differentiates meanings. The number of phonemes varies dramatically among languages and can vary even among dialects of the same language. We find phonemes by looking for minimal pairs of contrasts. And so when we change one sound in a word and thusly change its meanings, then we've identified a meaningful phoneme. So for example, we can look at contrasts like pit and bit. What if we changed? We changed the first consonant sound from a p to a b. Are pit and bit the same thing? Of course not. And so by changing that first consonant sound, we have changed the meaning of the word. Ball and call, we have changed again that first consonant sound. Cup and cap, we have changed the vowel sound in the middle. And so we've thusly changed it from something that we put on our head to something that we drink from. So Standard American English has 35 phonemes. 11 of these are vowels, 24 of these are consonants. When we think about the sounds that our consonants make, remember that some of them make similar sounds. For example, C and K can both produce a hard k sound. C and S can both produce a soft s sound. So this is how we determine what sound distinctions are present in languages. The average number of phonemes in languages varies from about 30 to 40. There is a huge range, however. Ritokas, which is a tribal language spoken in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, only has 11 different sounds. So it's a lot, let's say, linguistically simpler than even English. By contrast, the Djao languages, including the Khoisan language of the Kung in Botswana, we'll watch a film later in the term called Nai Story of a Kung Woman that will distinguish between or that will present this Khoisan language, has over 112 different sounds. And so when you even look at how this word is expressed, exclamation point at the beginning of the word, that represents a click, kind of a sound. Though I get too much of a CH in my click, I can't produce the hard click sound. And the accent mark over the O makes that a different sound than the tilde over the O. Those are two separate vowel sounds for the same letter. So when you watch the film later in the semester, Nice Story of a Kung Woman, I want you to pay attention to the how that they speak, because their language is a lot more complex linguistically in terms of phonemes than our own is. This also results in some stereotypes. So, we're almost to the winter break. And in the US in particular, we've got some cult classic films that we watch during the winter break. Maybe you watch How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Maybe you watch the 24 Hours of A Christmas Story that they play on, I think it's AMC or whatever. If you watch A Christmas Story, there's that scene, if you're familiar with it, where the dogs eat the Christmas turkey. And so the family goes out instead to a Chinese restaurant. And there's a Christmas carol that's sung at that Chinese restaurant. Do any of you remember what it is? If you recall, it is Deck the Halls. And so the way that the refrain or the chorus of Deck the Halls goes is fa la 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 la. In the film, because they're at a Chinese restaurant and you've got Chinese waiters singing that to you, they do it in a very stereotyped way, and that is fa ra 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 ra. Now, granted, that's maybe not culturally sensitive, right? This is a stereotype of the inability of speakers of Mandarin and Cantonese to produce a la sound. However, if you've interacted with people who were not exposed to English before high school, let's say, if you interact with native Mandarin or Cantonese speakers, they can't make that L sound. The la sound is not present in their spoken language. And so, critically, what this points out is that we have to hear sounds early in our life while our brain is still forming to be able to make those sounds later as an adult. And so there's this critical window of opportunity for learning different sounds. So you heard me try to make the click sound for Hoisan language. I can't do it. It sounds like instead of a real click because I didn't hear these clicks prior to about the age of 7. I also can't roll my R's. When I try to say something like burrito, you hear that? That is me trying to roll my R's. It doesn't sound a thing like the double R in Spanish. And my kids and my nephews make fun of me about this because they can do it with a lot of grace. I can, however, make the h sound like ich bin, whatever in German quite well because that is a sound that was more similar to sounds that I heard growing up. So I will never sound like a native Spanish speaker, regardless of how much Spanish I learn. I can pass as a native German speaker. So that stereotype presented in A Christmas Story comes from the fact that if Mandarin and Cantonese speakers do not hear the la phoneme before the age of 7, they can't produce that sound as an adult. So, what's the take-home message from this? I guess if you want your kids to be able to pick up languages with ease, you need to expose them to a variety of different languages as they're growing up. That exposure, even if you are a non-native speaker, just having that exposure will help their brains be able to produce a variety of sounds when they are adults. What's even better is raising kids bi or trilingually. If you've got native speakers in the home of foreign languages, have them speak to your babies while your babies are still young. My husband spoke only German to my daughter for the first 3 years of her life. She's now taking German in high school and it's a breeze. It's not hard for her to remember those foundations that were put in place, laid down in those first 3 years of life. He didn't do the same for my son. So when my son goes to learn German, he's going to have a much harder time. Phonetics is the study of speech sounds in general, what people actually say in various language, and phonemics is the study of significant sound contrasts, or the phonemes, in different languages. And so this diagram shows the phonemes and kind of how your muscles, particularly in the tongue, result in the production of different phonemes. So you can go through these sounds and kind of feel with your mouth how your tongue moves within your mouth. And we also move our palate when we speak. That is the soft tissue at the top of our mouth. And interestingly, in modern times, we have a greater degree of what we call malocclusion and narrow palates. That means that palates aren't expanding as they should during development. We're battling this through putting braces on younger and younger children. So now kids as young as 5 or 6 might get braces to help expand their palates, because having a narrow palate is associated with speech difficulties, swallowing difficulties, and tooth development, malocclusion, your teeth not lining up right. And so we used to wait and reserve orthodontia for teenagers, but now we can even prevent the need for orthodontia if we can put in palate expanders when kids are younger. What's responsible for narrow palates and then these resulting difficulties is we're not breastfeeding for as long. We engage in premature or early weaning. By a biological standpoint, we should breastfeed for about 4 or 5 years until that first molar comes in, arguably around the age of 6. From a cultural standpoint, we're not encouraged to breastfeed for 5 or 6 years. In fact, in the United States in particular, we look at women weirdly if they breastfeed for that long, right? We tell them that we might even say they're corrupting or doing a disservice to their infants. That we're hypersexualizing our infants. You can't nurse them for that long. It's bad for their psychological development. And so we see the same kind of thing in captive primates. If they're bottle fed and then weaned early, they have malocclusion difficulties. They've got difficulties vocalizing. So anyway, at your leisure, you could go through these sounds: beat, bit, bait, bet, and really pay attention to how your mouth is shaped differently internally, the movements that you make with your palate and your tongue to produce these different vowel sounds. All right, so with respect to I guess what we would call semanticity, right? Do we have, when we're ordering words and phrases, do we have similar grammar across different languages? Noam Chomsky is the linguistic anthropologist who's studied semanticity a lot. And he's associated with, he's perhaps the most famous linguist. It's who Nim Chimpsky and Project Nim was named after. Noam Chomsky proposes that the human brain contains a limited set of rules for organizing language. That is, that we have some sort of universal grammar. Some of the evidence that he uses to support this is that all languages have a common structural basis. We've got nouns, we've got pronouns, we've got verbs that we conjugate in similar ways to cover similar tenses. We've got objects of prepositions, so on and so forth. He's also used the fact that all humans have similar linguistic abilities and thought processes as evidence for a universal grammar. So our grammatical structure thusly would rest somewhere in our brains, in these universal components of our grammar. Another line of evidence is that humans can learn foreign languages, even foreign languages that are quite different linguistically, phonetically, etc., from the languages that we speak. So even though, let's say, Mandarin relies a lot more on the inflections of the words that you're saying, and you can change the whole meaning by changing the pitch of the utterance. People who speak English can still learn how to speak Mandarin. And then lastly, that words and ideas translate from one to another. So though the exact words being used may not be the same, we can convey an idea through a different, say, euphemism. So we could say something like, don't count your chickens before they hatch, right? What does that mean? It means don't count on your results, really. And that phraseology, the way that we might say that in different languages will be fundamentally different. It's not going to involve Hühn or Hane, which is the German for chickens, and the eggs, EI. But it may be a different euphemism, but we can get that idea across. By contrast, Sapir and Whorf propose that the grammatical categories in specific languages limit the ways that people who speak those languages can think. And so the evidence, the kind of case study here that has been used to support this is the Hopi language. In Hopi, they only have two verb tenses. In English, of course, we have three. We have past, present, and future. The Hopi structure their world differently. They have the verb tense that is that which is happening now or has ever happened, and the verb tense that which has not yet happened. So basically, the past and the present are combined into one verb tense. According to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, this means that the native Hopi speakers can't differentiate between the past and the present. So what is happening today and what happened yesterday are fundamentally the same thing, because their linguistic categories express that. Another example would be when we look at kinship terms in other cultures. So, for example, among the matrilineal Tarawads that we find in like Pakistan and such, they live in what we call matrilines. That means that relatedness and ownership and things are passed down from the mother. And so they have the same word for mother as well as maternal aunt, as so mother's sisters as well as grandmother. So all of those would be the equivalent of us saying mom. If we were to call our auntie's mom, we would be looked upon kind of weird. If we were to call our grandmother's mom, we would be looked upon kind of weird. And so, according to Sapir-Whorf, that would say that that members of these ethnic groups that live in these Tarawads would not be able to distinguish relatedness, that they would treat their mother the same as they would treat their aunt, as they would treat their grandmother, when in actuality, they are able to distinguish that degree of relatedness. Our mothers are related more closely to us than our grandmothers and our maternal aunts. So we are able to make distinctions, even though language doesn't have those distinctions. And the Hopi are able to distinguish between the past and present, even though they don't have separate verb tenses for that. These ethnic groups in Pakistan are able to distinguish between mom and her sisters, even though their linguistic terms don't reflect that. So we don't really find a lot of evidence in favor of Sapir and Whorf. Language shapes but doesn't restrict thought, because cultural changes can produce thought and language changes, which is contrary to Sapir-Whorf. With respect to our lexicons, our lexicon or vocabulary influences our perception of the world. And we specifically get focal vocabularies that are associated with kind of cultural significance. So we get specialized sets of terms that are that distinguish how things are referred to in particular groups. So one example that's brought up is our number of words for cattle. When we think about cattle in the English language, we've got cattle as one word, cow as another, bull, and heifer. That brings us up to 4. We might have a calf to distinguish a baby cow. We're up at 5. We might distinguish between Angus, Jersey, Hereford. I'm trying to think of another types of cattle, right? So we're up to 8 right now. We might distinguish between dairy cattle and beef cattle. That puts us up at 10. Given enough time, and if we had a training in animal science or livestock, right, husbandry, we might have maybe 20 different terms for cattle. The Nuer of South Sudan, who are pastoralists, they are part of this pastoral belt across the Sahel, which is the arid region, kind of scrubby growth, similar to our high desert, that borders the Sahara. There are people who engage in what we call the African cattle complex. So they base their livelihood in cattle. They sleep with their cattle. They travel with their cattle. Their daily activities are dictated by what cattle need. Their very identity is associated with cattle. They have upwards of 400 terms. So they might distinguish between a female cow who's never given birth and one who's given birth to one offspring versus a female cow who is a proven breeder and has a baby every year. They might have a different word for a dairy cow who's a copious milk producer versus one who struggles to produce milk. Which of those female cows would be slaughtered if there was a ceremonial need for a female cow to be slaughtered? Well, it's going to be the low producer, not the high producer, because the high producer is going to have some special terminology that designates her as one who's vital for their livelihood, for producing the resources that they consume. We can also think about these distinctions with snow, right? We've got snow, we've got slush, we've got powder. We've got a dusting of snow. We've got a blizzard. We don't have a lot of lexical distinctions for snow, whereas Arctic foragers do. With texture of snow, amount of snow, color of snow, the temperature of the snow, whether it's an early snow in the season or a later snow, right? A heavy spring snow, if it's come on top of a lighter powdery snow, can be really dangerous for avalanches. So language vocabulary is the area that changes very, very rapidly based on what needs arise. We have innovated a lot of new words in the past 10 years that relate to technology because technology is something that's rapidly changed. So language, culture, and thought are interrelated. It might be more accurate to argue that changes in culture produce changes in language and thought rather than to argue the reverse. We can see this reflected with cultural contrasts that affect lexical distinctions. When you think about the color in a box of Crayola crowns that you would use to color a white person, right? You don't use white for white people's skin. What color do you use? Well, in the Deep South where I grew up, we called that color peach. You use peach to color people's skin. And that would be a flesh tone that has kind of a reddish or pinkish undertone to it. In the Pacific Northwest, that same color might have been called salmon. In some boxes of Crown, that color might just be called flesh, right? As we've gotten more culturally sensitive with our terminology, we have started to even have what we call multicultural Crayolas, right? Boxes of crowns that just have varying skin tones. And each of those are just called skin tone crowns. So we're not making that same kind of, we don't have a box of crown now that has flesh. We name it something else. So semantics is this language's meaning system, the ways that we divide up the world, these lexical contrasts that we consider meaningful or significant reflect the overall experiences. Lastly, we'll talk about kind of ethnosemantics. The speakers of particular languages use sets of terms to organize their experiences and perceptions. These lexical categories and contrasts include things like kinship terminology and color systems. We come up with words to structure the world in the way that we find significant. So that may include the colors we use to describe things, that may include the focal vocabulary, that may include the ways that we structure our kinship terms. Basically, the way that we need our world ordered defines the meaning and these lexical contrasts.